Good evening from the White House in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. I'm Kelly Wright. Thank you for joining us this hour as we spend it together. And as always, I sincerely hope that wherever you are, that you're safe, that you're well, taking care of yourself and your family. My opening observation tonight, I'm here at the White House. Why? Well, it's because the president has unveiled a new executive order about deregulation and how it will impact communities of color and communities that are underserved and marginalized. This is so critical at a time like now because of the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has disrupted our communities and disrupted our economies because of health disparities and economic inequities. The bottom line is this: from the White House to your house and to Congress, something must be done to shore up the economic stability of this country. And we have to be concerned about the least of these. Otherwise, this economic experiment of getting through this COVID-19 pandemic will not work. We must have hope prevail, and we must put teeth into the programs so that we can take a bite out of the economy that's causing so much heartbreak and so much pain for all Americans, but particularly those Americans who are on the bottom rung, the underserved communities, the forgotten communities. And so because of that, we're here to talk about what's being done. What are the next steps that all of us can get behind in order to support our communities of color and our nation as a whole? And those are my opening observations. So my first guest tonight is Larry KUDLOW. He is the head of the National Economic Council. And here at the White House, we talked about those various things that will be going out to help all Americans. But in particular, I wanted to focus on what is being done from the White House to help communities of color. Here now is my interview with Larry KUDLOW. Mr. KUDLOW, I first want to thank you for being on tonight's program. It's indeed an honor to have you. I want to read something that the president stated in May as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the African American community. He stated, "My administration is pursuing a comprehensive strategy to address the full spectrum of needs in these communities, supporting both health and economic revitalization." How important is that now as you continue to roll out a plan to effectively help these communities?
What the president is saying, and it's backed up by all kinds of statistical facts, the biggest beneficiaries of his program to reduce 25,000 federal registered pages of regulations, the biggest beneficiaries are the bottom income quintile. So you have a ladder of income. The bottom quintile is the single biggest beneficiary. Their costs go down by 15%, which means obviously they have more household income and wages. And then the second quintile, so-called, goes up to about 45,000. And it's interesting to me, those are the income folks. There's the it's actually lower middle income folks, as I say, the most in need, who benefited the most from our tax cuts. Yeah, I know there's a lot of criticism, tax cuts for the rich. It's just not true factually. Yeah. And the regulatory relief program, we've cut 8 regulations for each one we've put on, which is, very cool. And the NEPA, the environmental regs, which the president will unveil in his executive order today, among other things, that'll give you access to infrastructure and permits within 2 years, not 10 years. So we'll be able to build whatever you need building, office buildings, commercial buildings, pipelines, facilities, hospitals, anything. We'll cut it to less than 2 years from, in many cases over 10 years. So I would argue for the group you're concerned about, as we all are, African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, women, they're the biggest beneficiaries of the deregulation process. I don't think folks know that, and I will say to you, you can look it up. Those are facts. I'm not making this stuff up.
Let's drill down on that, because when the president gives this executive order today, those particular communities that we've just talked about, African American, Hispanic, Native Americans, one of the things that they need, because of the disparities that do exist, not only health disparities, but the economic disparities.
Yes, capital access.
Capital access. Will that capital access become more fluid and more opportunistic for these communities as they operate under this new executive order?
Well, listen, there's a lot here. First of all, the executive order will help them enormously. I mean, again, take a simple thing like electricity. Okay, the cost of electricity has come down enormously. That by itself is probably down 20% because of our deregulation of oil and gas fracking and horizontal drilling. And we've opened the door to that. So everybody needs electricity. I don't care, your kids need it for the computers. I mean, you need it for heating and air conditioning or whatever. So households will have more money to spend or save after these cost reductions. It's like a tax cut. Basically, deregulation is a tax cut. Now, the other part of this, though, and I don't think the president gets near enough credit, we have set up this Opportunity Zone program nationwide. And you've got close to 1,000, or it might be slightly less than 1,000 opportunity zones. And that whole program is designed to give minority groups, particularly African Americans, access to much needed capital in their neighborhoods. I'm talking local stuff here. I'm talking smaller businesses, you know, maybe hotels, maybe rising to office buildings and so forth. But every study seems to show that. And that's why these opportunity zones, which provide tax benefits to bring in capital, so far have gotten off to a roaring start in the last couple of years. HUD Secretary Ben Carson has done a fabulous job, in my view. And over time, that's going to pay huge dividends. Now, again, the president's deregulation program will make it easier to build in those zones, you know? And if you get yourself some capital and you want it, I don't care what it is, a building, machinery, equipment, pipeline, I mean, it could be any darn thing. We will get it done faster with this new NEPA reg, which is basically going to drop the time of permitting, to under 2 years.
Yeah.
Not 10, not 12.
So, Mr. Kudlow, as you know, getting these disparities addressed within the African American community and the Brown and Native American communities is so vital. They need economic stability and vitality. How do the opportunity zones come into play?
State and local officials have been pretty cooperative. I mean, everybody wants greater opportunities for the African American community, for the Hispanic community. You know, we're in a tough time right now, lots of issues, lots of sensitivities. I'm just saying that we can't do everything here in the federal government, but we can give you more access to capital and money to put to work and create a business. And again, we'll cut the permitting time so you can get that done. Look, we're doing this in healthcare. We're deregulating all kinds of healthcare to deal with the pandemic. We've cut the cost of cars, right? So we have this CAFE fuel standards, which we pulled back significantly. That order probably went out 3, 4, 5 weeks ago. That'll cut the cost of a new car by $1,000. So just think about that for a second. You don't have to keep your old clunker, which is unsafe. We will give you a $1,000 credit so you can buy a new car, which will be safer, more fuel efficient, and pick up car sales. You know, so the showrooms and the car factories, which have reopened, fortunately, can have better business. Right now, by the way, car sales are booming. I don't know, people don't recognize that. I think they moved from about 3.5 million sales, which is very low last winter, to about 10.5 million already in the summer. So there's another example. CAFE fuel standards, form of deregulation, cheaper and safer cars.
Finally, sir, how would you characterize or describe the overall economy? Will we be able to rebound from this COVID-19 disruption?
We'll get there. And I think we'll get there with the same principles. You know, we had probably the healthiest economy pre-pandemic in at least a generation, maybe two, with 3.5% unemployment, with record low Black and Hispanic unemployment, and women's unemployment, record lows, no inflation. It was a heck of a ride, good stock market for retirement accounts. And I know we can rebuild it again. But I will say this: we're going to stay with our principles, which is keep taxes low, continue to chip away at these excessive, burdensome regulations, good trade deals, fair, reciprocal trade deals for farmers and manufacturers and everybody for that matter. That's what worked for the first 3 years and 2 months, and I believe it will work again. You'll hear more from us as we discuss the next care package on our proposals. And I'm absolutely confident. Look, you're talking to an optimist. What happened this winter with the pandemic was a bone crusher, massive heartbreak, massive hardships. I've never seen anything like it, and I've been around a while. But we will stay with first principles for growth and a healthy economy and safely. Let me just add that again. None of this works. We will not keep businesses open. We will not get schools open if we don't use masking and distancing and cleansing and testing. Okay, that's what the health experts say. It worked last winter. We've gotten these bump ups in the hot spots. I understand that. It's unfortunately part of the disease. But we beat it down once, we'll flatten it out again. But people must follow those simple 4 guidelines.
Absolutely.
Kids going to school can do it. Factory workers going back online can do it. Opening up small restaurants, they can all do it. Do ever what it takes. But yes, I am confident we will have a great second half of this year, probably 20% growth or better, and a terrific barn-burning 2021.
Sir, I appreciate and value your time. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Welcome back to the program. So there's been a lot of talk about what's going on in our society right now as it relates to the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, people reopening schools or some choosing not to. And that has caused some problems for parents and their children. So I thought I'd like to talk about the mental health aspects of what all of this means to each and every one of us in our families. And of course, as it relates to normal things like getting up and trying to figure out, is school safe? And so joining me now is Dr. COLLEEN HAWTHORNE. And Doc, it's good of you to join us today. From a mental health perspective, when the President of the United States says in a recent interview, yesterday he stated to a former colleague of mine who asked him the question about schools reopening, he basically stated that the Los Angeles city school system was making a mistake in not reopening, and that more parents and children are dying because they can't go back to school. Now, I can't get into what he meant by that, but under the surface, it seems to me that some people are desperately wondering, how do they deal with this new normal that's quite abnormal, and how does it affect them mentally in the home?
Kelly, again, it's great to be back with you, and you're bringing up such a relevant and timely discussion that we have to talk about right now. Schools, it's almost time for schools to be able to open back up, right? The thing is, we have to have a clear decision from leadership. We can adjust and adapt to anything. We know that, right? But you have to have clarity, consistency, and some level of calmness as we deal with things that are very difficult. So again, people can adapt, but we have to have the message clear. And I'm not sure, who needs to speak to the president to enforce to him, look, this is not the time for contention and confusion and chaos. We have to make a clear decision based on the science, based on people. This is what we have done for years, all our lives. So we understand certain things and nuances that may not be clear otherwise. It's very clear to any physician you speak with that we need to make a decision. If you put the kids back in school, all the kids back in school, there's great risk. So what we need to do is make a plan now, not tomorrow, next week, a plan now. We could come up with any plan that will work. But if we're not together, clear and consistent, then we have chaos. And that's what's driving some of the extra anxiety, That's what's driving some of the kind of impulsive discussions or things that people may be, doing. The lack of clarity and consistency and a level of calm as we're dealing with this situation.
Okay, so now with that inconsistency and the lack of that clarity, odd that you would mention that because I talked about clarity on the program yesterday. I opened up saying we need some clarity. So in the home, when a mother or father is talking to their child about the distance learning and about the impact of not returning to school because of the COVID-19, the fact that many states and locales and municipalities are not ready for it to go back to school. And certainly we need to do that, but at a time when it's safe. But I wanted to ask you, how does a parent deal with it on a mental level, as well as helping their children adjust to this from a mental standpoint so that they're strong going through it?
Kelly, and that's absolutely the key, is what do you say to folks? When the parent is able to sit down with the child and have the discussion and put them at ease, that's what the kids need. They're very adaptable. We're all adaptable. And so, again, from the top, we need clear guidelines that are very simple and reassuring. And the guidelines that allows the teachers and the school system to then look at, this is the decision we're making nationally. Nationally, it doesn't matter state to state. It's the same virus. It's going to impact the kids. Make the decision. We're not doing it yet so that people can move forward strategically. We're innovative people and come up with a solution that we're all going to follow. You let the kids know that. You let the parents know that. You let the teachers know that. Then we adjust. And we, can follow guidelines and then support one another because we're pretty much doing the same thing. So mentally speaking, that's what we need as people, right? Yeah. Whenever we have a clear vision, folks are on one accord, we then are able to relax and adjust and say, now, how do we make that happen? We see that, Kelly, let's look at the churches, for example. When this happened, we didn't have much notice. The churches had to make an adjustment. And so I have been so pleased with the platforms that they've just come up with. A lot of churches didn't have, and other institutions, these platforms to have, large video conferencing and just some of the other very innovative things we've come up with. That's the same thing for the school system. We need the decision. We need it now. We need to be on one accord and then plan strategically and innovatively. No one's going to die because they can't go to school for a year. Come on, Kelly. No. When we talk to our kids and then we're able to, even as parents, say, okay, this is the decision. This is what we're going to do in our home. For example, talking to my sister about this, she's got 3, young children, my awesome nieces and nephew, and she's a healthcare provider on the front line. And her husband, works out in the field. So as we're talking about this, we have different thoughts, but if the decision was made, we could say, okay, great. Dining room turns into the classroom. Do we need the living room, the dining room? Do we need a larger screen TV? But it's hard to make clear decisions when there is not clarity. And Kelly, really, this is too simple for us to be making this complicated. Okay. We make a decision, then we can innovate and plan around that. Get the funds we need, the support we need. Maybe I said this to my sister, just to throw it out there. Let's say the decision is absolutely made. The kids aren't going back right now. We're going to plan that, Maybe we decide, okay, the schools that were wearing uniforms, have the kids wear uniforms and come to the classroom, come to the monitor at a certain time. Those kind of things that normalize things for kids. That's all they need. Maybe then we decide, okay, at such and such time between these hours, this is when schools try to have lunch. Okay, that allows the parents, the caregivers, the aunties, the support folks to know, okay, who's bringing in lunch today? Are we going to call in lunch? What organizations are going to say, hey, we're supporting this. We're going to have lunch trucks come.
Yeah.
Kelly, we can do this. We need the decision. The decision is clear.
Okay.
Then we put things in place to support.
Dr. Colleen Hawthorne, thank you for joining us today and bringing us some salient information about how we can help our children and our parents, our families, get through this reopening or not reopening of schools. I appreciate you being on the program. Wish we had more time. Got to keep moving on. There's a lot to unpack today. Doctor, thank you as always.
You're most welcome, Kelly. My honor.
All right. Welcome to the program, and I'm so delighted to introduce you to my guest who's going to talk to us about that dialogue that I think is so important. That's having a conversation about race. We need a national conversation about it. Certainly, you've seen this on the program before where we've stepped into the waters of talking about the murky waters, I should say, of trying to clear it up in terms of our racial harmony in this country. And that is Cherry Steinwender. She joins us now. And Cherry, you're joining us from the Houston, Texas area, right? And the name of your organization is what?
The Center for the Healing of Racism.
You know, I love that. The Center for the Healing of Racism.
Yes.
And then one might ask the question, why do we need such a center? Explain why.
Well, let me say this to you, Kelly. I'm not one of the new kids on the block. I've been doing this for 31 years. And in fact, I am telling everybody that I speak to in all of the interviews that I've been on, it's really our time now. And what I mean by that, the country is just catching up with us. See, we started off with the word racism. We never called it multiculturalism, sensitivity training, or anything like that, because we knew if it walks like a duck, looks like a duck, quack like a duck, it's racism. So we stayed the course for 31 years. And even when people were so uncomfortable with the word racism in our name, they even asked or told us we should take racism out of our name. And I always said to them, that's not an option. So what you want me to replace it with? The Center for Healing Multiculturalism? I'm not healing from multiculturalism. I'm healing from racism. And I've been thinking a lot since May the 23rd when George Floyd was murdered. If people had really paid attention to us over these whole 31 years, would we be where we are now? And so I say to your audience that it is our time. You are catching up with us because we've been talking about and educating people, institutionalized, systemic, racism, structural racism. We've been doing all of that. And it's not just necessary now, it's been necessary in this country forever.
400 years
But
been fighting and battling to get to a place called equality. It's in our Constitution, it's in our Declaration of Independence, but Cherry, it does not appear to be in the hearts of men and women the way it needs to be. How do you bring healing to those kinds of stony hearts to make them open and receptive to healing and hope that they can be schooled to the level that you are and that I am, because we're woke. We know what the deal is.
Oh, yes. Well, one of the first things that I would say is that everybody's trying to fix humanity, but nobody wants to fix themselves. And what I really want your audience to get this, you can't change nobody. I don't go out seeking to change people. I do know, however, all of the people, and I have been in the front of over 100,000 people in 31 years, and I've had so many people come back to me. The information you provide, the way you conduct the dialogues changed my life. It is a life changing. It is a way of really educating people of how they got set up in this country to play out this us and them that make them want to take the next step. And in doing that, I always say if enough people become educated and empowered around what racism is and what it isn't, soon it will no longer be safe for anyone to use all these racist epithets and say and do all these crazy things. But we have to reach that critical mass. I think right now, the critical mass is happening right now. But at the same time, I recognize some people will never get this message because they don't want to. Human beings hear what they want to hear and they see what they want to see, you know, and they make a turkey look like a bird if they want to. So I go back to the thing. We have educated over 100,000 people in 45 states. We've worked in Canada, we've worked in Austria, and we have not reached the critical mass yet.
What's it going to take to reach critical mass? Because God forbid we have to go through another George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery or even back to Emmett Till and the countless of other men and women who have been lynched in this country because of the color of their skin.
Yes. And, you know, when I speak of the history of this country, and I like to start that in this country, that we were enslaved. And that's a very, very brutal system. But at the same time, I was not considered a human being. I said, that's the most important thing. Yes, I was enslaved, but I was not considered a full human being. And until we can get people educated that all of us, regardless of what our hue is, that we are all human beings. And even if you put it in religious context, we're only all members of the same human family. Or even if you look at it according to anthropologists, scientists, and whatever, that we are all Homo sapiens sapiens with at least 99.9 DNA in common. That's one thing. But the other thing too, when we conduct all of our workshops, we will never let you come out of your head. You're going to go into your heart. You're going to go deep and you will come out with what is so difficult. You're going to talk about your feelings, how you are really feeling. How are you really feeling when you watched the lynching of George Floyd? I want to know how you felt. I don't want to know up here in your head. And so when I say, how did you really feel? And one of the feelings that I felt so much anger because I recognized the history in this country of lynching of over 4,000 Black people in this country, mainly men, that there were invitations sent out, whether by telephone, word of mouth, or telegram, inviting you to the lynching. And so droves of people showed up to the lynching. I know in Macomb, Georgia, gee whiz, over 3,000 people showed up for that lynching. But the thing of it is, they were invited. They had a choice to go or not to go. But you see, I turned on my television set. I didn't ask to see what I saw, but I did. And I will never, ever be able to unsee it. And I really feel when that thing touched people's heart, you couldn't rationalize that intellectually. And now people are coming out with all these signs and everything else and all of these marches, and not only in the United States, but worldwide. I think we are reaching the critical mass, and I'm gonna tell you why. Now they're using racism. And if you can't name it, you can't do anything about it. I think we are on the road to the critical mass.
That's it's really powerful what you just said, Cherry. I'm going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll drill down on that word racism and the definition of it and what we can do about it. We'll be back with more after the break.
Welcome back to the program. So I'm talking to Cherry Steinwender, and she is out of Houston, Texas, and she has an incredible organization. And for 30 years, she's been actively engaged in talking about racism at a time that it wasn't welcome. And yet you've had the tenacity and the faith to keep pushing the envelope so that people can sit down and have an uncomfortable dialogue about racism. I want to ask you, what's your definition of racism and why is it so uncomfortable for people to talk about it?
Well, first of all, I'm going to tell you what people are so confused in this country, which makes it difficult for them to have the conversation because they interchange racism and prejudice as being the same thing. Racism and prejudice is not the same thing. And you know, I love to listen to the but people. I'm not racist, but, and I'm not, but, you know, all the but people.
Yeah.
Well, interestingly enough, prejudice is to prejudge, to form information and opinions based on insufficient data. We all exercise prejudice. You know, I may be prejudiced against grass weed because I've never tasted, don't know what it looked like or whatever, and I've formed an opinion that I don't like it. But we form these opinions about human beings based on insufficient data. That's not the same as racism. See, most people think, well, I'm not racist because I've never called anyone a bad name. I'm not racist because I never grew up in a neighborhood with people of color. I'm not racist because I've never spit on anybody and whatever. But bottom line is that's manifestations of racism. Racism is an institutionalized system that was put together in this country 400 plus years ago to be able to have some with privileges and others without. It is a whole system. And this system is systemic because every institution in this country, from the educational institution to the healthcare to the religious faith communities, there is element, has always been elements of how this country was set up and how this system operates. It was very interesting also when you say what it is, what racism is, it's an institution. Mm-hmm. And this institution was developed based on the prejudice that the people in power had against people of color. And they used all of these forms of prejudice that they had against people of color and created a system because they had the power to do it. And so the quickest formula that you can use is prejudice plus power equals racism. That's a quick formula. You could just pull it out just that quick. And at the other hand, one of the ways that it manifests itself, and I'm sure you're aware of it, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Just last month, a young lady, I think her name is Kennedy Mitchell, she had been writing to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, letting them know that that definition is flawed. And she stayed the course. And now they have agreed to change the definition of racism in that dictionary. And if I don't have the papers in front of me to pull it out to exactly what the definition is and what they will change it to, it will be changed now to include the institutional systemic racism in this country. Yes. So if people are reading the Merriam-Webster Dictionary in order to find out the meaning to define racism, they got a warped definition in the first place. But I love what Martin Luther King said. We hate each other and we fear each other because we don't know each other, because we have been separated from each other. And the separation is also the problem.
And a problem it is. I want to ask you, and of course, this is all about getting to a place where we can literally say and believe, united we stand. How do we get to that place wherein we are united, we are standing, and we are breaking through the barriers of racism by healing and getting rid of it as if it were some cancer that needs to be cut out?
Well, one of the things I will say is definitely a disease of ignorance. It's too many people in this country that's totally ignorant because we depend on an educational system that does not have our best interests in heart. And a lot of the history, we were either left out of the history or either some crazy little story around the history. It's very interesting to me to even find out in the way history is taught today that people of Latin descent are called all these negative terms. So you see, that's not who they really are. But you see, that's what your children are learning right now because Texas buys more history books than any other state. And so we can control the narrative, you see. So when I look at all of this, I want to go back to we are separated from each other. Within Houston, Texas, we are the most diverse city in the United States. So everybody is here, but we have very distinct pockets of communities where everybody within those communities look exactly the same. The other thing, we are separated from each other because if you can afford to put your child in a private school, and I've been to too many of the private schools, then they all look white. And what is very interesting, working with the woman that was in Houston for 8 years, and she found the center as soon as she moved to Houston. And I would get her to work with me in the educational systems. And when we are in the private schools, all those kids look exactly the same. And then she looked at me and she said, well, where are the children of color? I say, you know where they are. They're in these independent school districts, because their parents don't have the money to send them to. So that's a type of separation. So what are you learning? If you're in a school, but everybody look like you, what are you learning? Yeah. So that's separation. The other part too is that people want to, remind me, well, Cherry, after all, the civil rights laws have been passed. Yeah, they have been passed, but they have found ways to get around keeping us separated. And you see, these institutions can no longer leave a paper trail. They can't write it down, but they come up with all kinds of ways to separate us, even in hiring practices, you see. So that's keeping us separated from each other. And the other part too, is that I really love this one, how people will say, well, I don't have anything against people of color, but not with my daughter or my son, you see. And so this separation goes on. And then, to be totally honest with you, I learned a lot of what I use in the workshops that I conduct, because that name Steinwender is a German name. My husband is white, blonde, and blue eyes, and I've been married to him for 39 years. He came to the United States not speaking English. And what is so interesting about that, my husband sees America the way it really is, because he will say to any white person, the America that you live in and that I live in, and I'm not even an American because my husband is not a citizen, is totally different from the America my wife lived in, and she's American. See, my husband can tell you straight up because he's observed this. He looked at it. He's the one that had people that look like him come up and say all of these crazy things about people of color, assuming, well, you're white, blonde, and blue-eyed just like me, so you in my camp and we think exactly the same way. Mm-hmm. So you see, when other couples are having all this Gucci, little sweet talk, getting ready to retire at night, my pillow talk sometimes goes like, well, darling, today this guy came up to me on the job and told me all these bad things about Black people. So you see, I get a lot of my information on the pillow talk.
Sherry, you're definitely in the business to heal people of every racial thinking that they have. It's called the Center for Healing Racism.
Yes.
And how can we get in contact with you?
Well, oh, gee whiz. All you have to do is go to our website, www.centerhealingracism.org.
I appreciate you. I appreciate the dialogue that we just had. And certainly like to have more of this dialogue, because we do have to be bold enough, strong enough, and open enough to talk about the R word, racism. Because if we don't talk about it and have some conversation, we may never see the solution. And certainly you're bringing the solution by starting right where people are and letting them recognize their own sins of racism. And I appreciate everything that you're doing to do that.
And I would love to be invited back, because see, I just got started.
Well, we're going to have to come back and do an entire dialogue, because you and so many other organizations are talking about this. And this is the time. Like you said earlier, we're at a critical mass. We're at a tipping point, and we can go forward, or we can paralyze ourselves in fear and not have the courage to move forward. But I think with people like you around, Sherry, and the pillow talk that you're having, we can get there.
Thank you so much for having me, Kelly.
Thank you, Cherry. I appreciate you. Cherry Steinwender.
Yes.
Appreciate you and all the efforts that you're doing with the Center for Healing Racism. And certainly together we can do it. Thank you.
Welcome back to the program. So I want to thank all of the guests who appeared on tonight's program, and I would also like to thank you for taking the time out to watch. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you spending your valuable time with me. As always, with my final word, I hope that you've been righted, ignited, and united to not spread fear, to not spread hate, but to keep spreading knowledge, love, freedom, and peace. From the White House, I'm Kelly Wright. Good night.
Red, black, or white, but it's crimson. We all bleed the same. If you don't feel the groove, it's alright. Just give it time, give it time. Come on, y'all. Get on board. Mankind won't survive if our hearts beat inside a hateful rhythm. You see, love isn't bought, but comes with a price.